November 4th, 1942. Washington, D.C. A folder stamped with the highest classification markings in the United States government lands on the desk of a Marine Corps intelligence officer, and what it contains will not be seen by the public for more than 30 years. The folder holds a translation, not of American documents, but of German ones, a collection of intelligence assessments, military attaché reports, and operational analyses produced by the Wehrmacht's foreign armies, West Division, and by the German military intelligence apparatus in the years between 1940 and 1942, all focused on the same subject, the United States Marine Corps. The Germans had been watching the Marines for 2 decades. They had studied the performance of Marine units at Belleau Wood in 1918, where a single Marine brigade had stopped a German advance that had broken every French formation in its path and had earned from German soldiers a name, Teufelhunden, devil dogs that entered military legend and never left it. They had watched Marine amphibious doctrine develop in the 1930s through attaché reports filed from exercises on the Atlantic coast and the Pacific. They had read the technical manuals that American military publishing made available and had analyzed the doctrine that those manuals described, and what they had concluded in documents that the American intelligence services obtained through a combination of captured materials and source operations that themselves remained classified for decades, was something that the United States government, in the autumn of 1942, with the Pacific War still very much in doubt and the morale of a nation at full mobilization in the balance, decided should not be made public. The German assessment of the United States Marine Corps was too flattering, too specific, too analytically accurate in ways that revealed the depth of German intelligence penetration of American military doctrine. And it described a fighting force in terms that the American government believed the Japanese enemy, if they read those assessments in Allied publications, might use to better prepare their own defenses. The folder went into a classified archive. The archive went into a vault in the Navy Department buildings in Washington, where it sat alongside the other wartime intelligence materials whose sensitivity had not diminished simply because the specific operation that produced them was complete. It sat there through the rest of the Second World War. It sat there through Korea and through the McCarthy era and through the Cuban Missile Crisis and through Vietnam. The men who had classified it in 1942 retired and died and were succeeded by men who did not know the folder existed, or who knew it existed and had inherited the standing decision not to review the classification. And the German military's honest accounting of what they believed the Marine Corps to be, and what they feared it was capable of, waited there for more than 3 decades before the systematic declassification reviews of the 1970s and the historians who followed them began piecing together what the Germans had actually known and said and written in clinical professional language about the men in the Globe and Anchor. The picture that emerged from those documents was not what the historians expected. It was more specific, more analytically sophisticated, and more prophetically accurate than anyone who had not read the documents would have predicted. And it raised, for the military historians who spent years reconstructing the picture, a question that the documents themselves could not answer. If the German military had known all of this, in this much analytical detail, before the war began, why had that knowledge not produced a more effective counter? The question is not rhetorical. It has a real answer, and the answer is one of the most instructive things the German intelligence assessment of the Marine Corps reveals about the nature of military intelligence as a discipline. Knowing what an enemy can do, and knowing it with analytical accuracy, is not the same as being able to prevent that enemy from doing it. The German military knew, before the first Marine landed on a Pacific beach, what Marine training produced, what Marine officers were selected for, what Marine doctrine prescribed, and what the institutional identity of the Corps demanded of the men who served in it. They knew it in writing, in classified documents, that professional military analysts had produced with the care and precision that German military professionalism demanded. They could not use this knowledge to prevent what happened at Guadalcanal or Tarawa or Iwo Jima, because the knowledge described qualities that could not be countered by any defensive preparation. You cannot build a fortification that stops a man who has been trained not to stop. You cannot design a defensive fire plan that defeats an institutional identity. The German analysts knew what the Marine Corps was. What they could not know, and what the campaign in the Pacific demonstrated, was what it was possible to do against men who had been made that way on purpose. To understand why German military intelligence took the United States Marine Corps seriously enough to produce formal analytical assessments of its doctrine, training, and combat potential, you have to go back to a mud-filled wheat field in France in June of 1918, where the Marine Corps' institutional reputation and the specific fear that the German military would carry into the Second World War was born in 3 weeks of fighting so brutal and so costly and so ultimately decisive that both sides spent years afterward trying to understand what had happened there. The Second Battle of the Marne was turning against the Allies in early June 1918, when the 4th Marine Brigade, part of the Army's 2nd Infantry Division, was ordered to stop the German advance at a place called Belleau Wood. The orders were given because the Marine unit was available and in position, not because anyone expected it to succeed where French divisions had failed. What followed across the next 26 days was one of the most sustained and costly infantry engagements that American forces had experienced since the Civil War. The Marines attacked Belleau Wood 6 times before taking it. They took casualties that would have destroyed a formation with less institutional cohesion. Approximately 9,000 killed and wounded out of roughly 8,000 men engaged. A casualty rate that exceeded 100%, because replacements were fed into the fighting as fast as they arrived and immediately absorbed into the same rate of loss. They fought through gas attacks, through machine gun fire from positions that had been designed to stop exactly the kind of frontal assault that Marine doctrine at that time required, through terrain that gave every advantage to the defender and no advantage to the attacker, except the specific quality that Marine training had produced in the men attacking: the refusal to stop. The Germans who faced the Marines at Belleau Wood filed after action reports that described an enemy unlike any they had previously encountered in the war. Men who attacked through fire that should have halted them, who kept coming when the tactical calculation said they should stop, who took casualties that would have destroyed unit cohesion in a conventional formation and maintained coherence through them on what appeared to be individual rather than institutional grounds. The German 28th Division's after-action report, captured by Allied forces in 1918 and later incorporated into the intelligence file that became the classified folder of 1942, used language that German military writing, with its preference for precise technical description, almost never applied to enemy infantry. It described the Marines as ferocious. The word it used was wild in the sense of uncontrolled, in the sense of operating outside the behavioral framework that the German army associated with trained infantry, in the sense of men who were advancing through fire, that, by the German army's training doctrine, should have caused them to halt and consolidate and wait for supporting elements before continuing. The Marines were not waiting, they were not halting, they were not consolidating. They were advancing, individually and collectively, with an energy that the German infantry facing them could not match at the specific moment when the German line had enough depth to absorb and stop a normal infantry assault, and that energy was carrying the Marine attack through depths it should not have been able to penetrate. The battle cost the Marines more than any previous American engagement in France, and the German units facing them suffered casualties proportionate to the cost. The 237th Division, the 28th Division, the 197th Division, all filing reports that described an enemy who did not respond to fire the way the German army's experience predicted enemy infantry should respond to fire. The reports went into German archives. They were studied. The men who studied them did not dismiss what they read. They filed it under the category of information that military professionalism requires you to take seriously, even when, especially when, it is inconvenient. The institutional memory of Belleau Wood shaped the German military's approach to marine intelligence for the next 24 years. German military attachés in Washington in the 1920s and 1930s attended marine exercises when they could, read marine publications when they were available, and reported back to Berlin on the specific characteristics of marine training that the Belleau Wood engagement had identified as the source of the combat effectiveness the German 28th Division had encountered. What the attachés found, and what their reports described with a precision that the American classification authorities of 1942 found valuable enough to protect from enemy scrutiny, was that the Marine Corps had built its institutional identity around a specific proposition: that the most demanding training that could be designed and survived was less demanding than combat, and that a man who had been subjected to the worst his instructors could produce was a man whose first serious experience of actual enemy fire produced recognition rather than shock. The Marines called it making men. The German analysts called it the creation of a fighting type, a Kampf type, that existed in no other military formation they had studied, and that possessed specific qualities described in the attaché reports with clinical German thoroughness, that gave the Marine Corps a tactical capability at the individual soldier level that exceeded any comparable infantry force the Wehrmacht had assessed. The attaché reporting of the 1930s documented 3 specific qualities that the German analysis identified as the source of marine tactical effectiveness, and the documentation was specific enough that the American classification authorities of 1942, who were simultaneously managing a wartime censorship operation designed to prevent military information from reaching the enemy, found the specificity itself a security concern. A German intelligence report that accurately identified the specific training standards of the Marine Corps, the specific physical conditioning requirements, and the specific leadership development philosophy was a report that a Japanese intelligence officer reading it could use to calibrate his own unit's preparation for confronting the Marines. The Americans classified it not because the information was secret from the Marines lived it, but because a precise German analysis of what made the Marines effective was more analytically useful to an enemy than any propaganda the Americans could produce about the same subject. The first quality the German analysis documented was marksmanship. Not the institutional qualification standards that most armies maintained as ceremonial benchmarks, but a genuine individual marksmanship standard enforced at every level of the Corps and maintained through regular qualification requirements that actually determined a Marine's status within his unit. A Marine private in 1940 was, by the German attaché's assessment, a marksman by any standard that the German army applied to that term. The second was physical conditioning, a training regime that the attaché described as more demanding than anything comparable in the German army's enlisted training, producing men whose baseline physical capability exceeded the German army's infantry standard and whose capacity for sustained physical effort under combat conditions was consequently higher. The third, and the one that the German analysts found most difficult to quantify, but most important to identify, was what they described in their reports as Korpsgeist, Corps spirit, the specific institutional identity that the Marine Corps cultivated in its members with an intensity that the German analysis compared in their private correspondence to the ideological conditioning of the SS, with the important distinction that the Marine Corps' institutional identity was not ideological but professional, built around standards of performance rather than political conviction, and therefore more broadly applicable and more resistant to the kinds of internal political pressures that could compromise ideological cohesion. The classified folder of November 1942 represented the accumulation of this analytical work, combined with the operational reporting that the German military had been collecting since the Pacific War began in December 1941. The Marines had been in combat for less than a year when the folder was assembled, but the operational data was already substantial. The defense of Wake Island in December 1941, 449 Marines of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion under Major James Devereux, holding a Pacific atoll against the assault of a Japanese naval force that included cruisers, destroyers, and more than 500 naval landing troops, had provided the first operational data point. The Wake Island defenders, armed with 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 6 5-inch coastal defense guns, a dozen .50 caliber machine guns, and whatever infantry weapons the 449 Marines of Devereux's battalion had carried onto the atoll, sank 2 Japanese destroyers with coastal defense guns, damaged a cruiser and several other vessels, shot down 21 Japanese aircraft, and held the initial assault for 15 days in a defensive action that produced a kill ratio the German analysts found, in their precise language, instructive. When the second Japanese assault overwhelmed the position on December 23, 1941, the decision to surrender was made not because the Marines had stopped fighting, but because the position was physically untenable. The remaining aircraft had been destroyed, the gun emplacements had been put out of action by naval gunfire and bombing, and the relief force that had been en route from Pearl Harbor had been recalled. The Marines at Wake had not run out of will. They had run out of working guns. The German analysis noted this distinction with the care that professional military intelligence applies to facts that matter. The Wake Island defenders fought until their weapons were gone, not until the tactical situation was unfavorable. The difference between those two things is, in the German army's own professional ethos, the difference between a military unit and a fighting force. German military analysts examining the Wake Island engagement in early 1942 noted in the report that was eventually incorporated into the classified file that a force of 449 men had inflicted casualties disproportionate to their own strength against a numerically superior and better equipped attacking force, and that the specific qualities of fire discipline and positional defense that the attackers encountered matched the qualities the attaché reports of the 1930s had predicted the Marine Corps would exhibit in combat. August 7th, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The 1st Marine Division under Major General Alexander Vandergrift lands on a Japanese-held island in the first American offensive operation of the Pacific War, and what follows across the next 6 months generates more operational data for the German analysis than any intelligence operation could have anticipated. The Guadalcanal campaign is exactly what the German analysts had been trying to model in their pre-war assessments. A sustained combat operation under extreme conditions against a determined and capable enemy, with no possibility of rotation or rest, with supply lines that are contested by the enemy's naval and air forces, and with no outcome other than success or destruction available to the force committed. It is the test that every military intelligence assessment attempts to predict, and that actual combat is the only means of confirming. And the 1st Marine Division, across 6 months of fighting at the Tenaru River, at Bloody Ridge, at the Matanikau River, through the disease and the hunger and the constant Japanese night attacks that made sleep impossible and coherent, Defensive planning, a daily exercise in prioritization under exhaustion, produces a performance that the German analysts observing from the intelligence files find, in their clinical language, remarkable. The Tenaru River engagement of August 21st, 1942, is the first major ground combat test. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's elite 28th Infantry Regiment, 917 men who have been told by their commanding officer that the Marines can be defeated in a frontal night assault, attacks the 1st Marine Division's perimeter at 0200 hours. The Marines of Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, have had 2 weeks to prepare their position, have laid wire and pre-registered artillery fires, and have placed their machine guns to cover the sandbar at the mouth of the Tenaru River, that is the logical crossing point for an attacker approaching from the east. Ichiki's men hit the wire in the darkness and die on it, cut down by machine gun fire from positions that were placed precisely, because Marine defensive doctrine prescribes placing machine guns to cover wire obstacles. Because covering wire with machine gun fire is the doctrinal solution to the problem of wire in a defended perimeter. And because the Marines executing this doctrine have been trained to it in precisely the detail that makes its execution automatic under the stress of a night attack. By morning, 800 of Ichiki's 917 men are dead. The colonel burns his regimental colors and takes his own life. The 1st Marine Division has taken 34 killed and 75 wounded. The German intelligence assessment of this engagement, produced within weeks by the attaché network that was monitoring the Pacific War through Japanese and neutral sources, notes the specific ratio: 800 Japanese dead against 34 Marine killed, and observes that a kill ratio of this magnitude in a defensive engagement is not a product of chance or superior equipment. It is a product of training, preparation, and the specific doctrinal application that the pre-war attaché reports had identified as characteristic of Marine Corps performance. The assessment is classified the moment it is produced. The American government does not want this ratio published in newspapers. The Japanese enemy does not need more motivation to study Marine defensive preparations before attacking them. The near failure that tests the entire Guadalcanal defense, and that comes closer to ending the Marine position than any subsequent combat, arrives not in a single dramatic engagement, but across a period of 3 weeks in September and October 1942, when the combination of Japanese night attacks, disease casualties, supply shortages, and the continuous stress of defending a perimeter with insufficient men, produces, in the 1st Marine Division's command, the specific crisis of operational planning under extreme attrition that the German assessment had been attempting to model. Brigadier General Roy Geiger commands Marine Air at Henderson Field, the airfield whose defense is the strategic objective of the entire Guadalcanal operation. With fewer aircraft than he needs, in aircraft that are maintained by crews working without adequate spare parts or rest, against a Japanese air force that is flying from Rabaul and is capable of putting dozens of aircraft over Henderson Field on any given day. The Battle of Bloody Ridge in September 1942, the assault by Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Brigade, approximately 6,000 men, against the perimeter of the Lunga perimeter held by the 1st Marine Raider Battalion and 1st Marine Parachute Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, is the moment the Guadalcanal campaign is nearly lost. Edson's force is 840 men, holding a ridge that is the direct approach to Henderson Field, against 6,000 Japanese soldiers who attack in successive waves through the night of September 13th. The Marines are pushed back. The ridge is contested for 9 hours. Men are fighting at distances of 30 feet, in darkness broken only by the muzzle flashes of weapons being fired faster than their cooling mechanisms are designed to sustain in a position that has been reduced from its original depth to a final defensive line on the ridge's highest ground, from which further retreat means the loss of Henderson Field. Edson walks the line at 0300 hours in the middle of the Japanese attack, telling his men to hold, not encouraging them, telling them. The distinction matters, and the German analysts, when this engagement's details reach their file through the neutral nation reporting networks that German intelligence maintained throughout the Pacific War, recorded it. Edson's calm is not theatrical. It is not the performance of a man who is suppressing fear with professional effort. It is the quality of a man for whom the appropriate response to a desperate situation is the same as the appropriate response to any other situation, which is to identify what needs to be done and communicate it clearly to the men who need to do it. Marine officer selection in the 1930s and 1940s was not designed to find brave men. Every military selects for courage in its officer corps. Marine officer selection was designed to find men who remained operationally effective, who continued to identify, decide, and communicate in conditions that disrupted operational effectiveness in officers from other services. The German analysts who had studied Marine officer training in their attaché reports described the output of that process in their assessments with a specificity that the American classification authorities of 1942 found worth protecting. They described Marine officers as men who had been selected and trained to function normally in abnormal circumstances, and they described this quality as the specific characteristic that made Marine units tactically coherent at casualty rates that would have disrupted the command structure of comparable formations in other services. The Marines hold. Henderson Field survives the night. The Guadalcanal campaign does not end on September 13th, 1942. The Marines hold. Henderson Field survives the night. The Guadalcanal campaign does not end on September 13th, 1942. And the reason it does not is the specific institutional quality that the German intelligence reports of November 1942 were attempting to quantify. The classified folder grows thicker through 1942 and 1943 as the operational data accumulates. Tarawa in November 1943, where the 2nd Marine Division, under Major General Julian Smith, assaults a strongly fortified Japanese position on Betio Island with approximately 18,000 Marines across a 76-hour battle that takes 1,000 American killed and 2,100 wounded. The highest casualty rate per unit time of any American operation in the Pacific War, also generates a German intelligence assessment that arrives in the classified file and that notes, with the specific factual precision that German military analysis considered the foundation of useful intelligence, a single central fact: the Marines continued the assault. The first waves landed in water that the pre-landing bombardment had failed to clear of obstacles, in landing craft that grounded on a reef 500 meters from the beach and were cut apart by Japanese fire from positions that the bombardment had not destroyed. The men who survived the reef crossing were hit again in the water between the reef and the beach. The men who reached the beach were pinned by fire from positions that had survived everything the Navy had put on them and that commanded the beach at ranges measured in dozens of meters. Photographs taken after the battle show a beach whose sand has been replaced, in places, by the bodies of the Marines who crossed it. Against this, subsequent waves continued to land. Not because the men in those waves did not understand what they were landing into, not because the communications failed to report what the first waves had encountered, but because the assault continued and the men in the subsequent waves were Marine infantry who had been trained for an assault that continued. The German assessment of Tarawa noted this and described it in the terms their analytical framework provided. They were correct that the Marines continued the assault. They were not able to fully explain within their analytical framework. Why? The assault did not stop at the water's edge when the first waves were cut apart by fire that the pre-landing bombardment had failed to suppress. It did not stop when the second wave was hit. It continued, with men who had watched their units destroyed in the water ahead of them advancing into the same fire, because the institutional conditioning of the Marine Corps had produced in those men a relationship with the continuation of the assault that could not be interrupted by the specific combination of fear and rational calculation that stops most men in most armies when the situation objectively supports stopping. The German assessment does not describe this as bravery in the conventional sense. It describes it in terms that are more disturbing. It describes it as conditioning, as the product of a training system that had removed from the available behavioral responses of Marine infantry the option of halting when forward movement was tactically costly. The German analysts found this quality, which they described in their clinical language as gefährliche Beharrlichkeit, dangerous persistence, more threatening than any particular tactical capability the Marine Corps possessed, because it was not a capability that could be countered by a specific defensive measure. It was a quality of the men themselves. The American decision to classify these reports in 1942 and maintain their classification for more than 30 years was not a simple security decision. It was a compound decision, reflecting multiple concerns simultaneously. The tactical security concern was real. Publishing German assessments of marine training methodology and doctrinal practice would have provided the Japanese military with a detailed analytical framework for understanding marine combat behavior that Japanese intelligence had not independently developed. The propaganda concern was equally real. The German assessment's language, its clinical admiration, its precise identification of qualities that the German military itself valued and found in the Marine Corps, was not the kind of information that American wartime communication authorities wanted circulating freely, because it complicated the straightforward narrative of Allied moral superiority over the Axis that American public communication required. And the intelligence methodology concern was perhaps the most sensitive of all: the specific means by which the American government had obtained the German intelligence reports. The source operations, the captured document exploitation, the signals intelligence that had identified the existence of the assessments before they were physically obtained, represented capabilities whose continued existence depended on the enemy not knowing they had been compromised. The declassification process that began in the mid-1970s under the Freedom of Information Act and the systematic review of World War II era classified records mandated by executive orders signed by Presidents Nixon and Ford that required the intelligence community to review documents more than 25 years old and declassify those whose continued classification no longer served a current national security purpose. Produced a series of document releases that allowed historians to reconstruct, for the first time, the full scope of German military intelligence analysis of the Marine Corps from the 1920s through the end of the war. The process was not fast. Individual documents required review by multiple agencies. The CIA, which had inherited parts of the wartime OSS archive, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which managed the captured German military records that American forces had seized at the end of the war, and the Marine Corps itself, which maintained its own institutional archive of the documents that had referenced its own forces and which had its own equities in the classification decisions that had been made in 1942. The reviews took years. Some documents were declassified completely. Some were declassified with redactions that preserved the identity of the specific intelligence sources and methods that had produced the original collection. Some remained classified through the 1980s on the judgment of the reviewing agencies, that specific technical methodologies they described remained sensitive even 4 decades after the war that had produced them. But enough was released, and released in sufficient detail, to allow the reconstruction that military historians in the late 1970s and 1980s began to piece together from the declassified files. What those documents revealed was a picture more comprehensive and more analytically sophisticated than the American government had anticipated when it classified them. A picture that showed the German military taking the Marine Corps more seriously, at a deeper analytical level, and with more accurate understanding of its institutional structure than the classified decisions of 1942 had assumed. The German analysts had not merely described what the Marines did, they had described why they did it, in terms that accurately identified the training philosophy, the selection process, the institutional culture, and the leadership development system that produced the combat performance the German military feared. The assessments were not propaganda. They were not written to intimidate. They were written by professional military intelligence officers doing their jobs, and their jobs required them to tell the truth about an enemy force as accurately as the available evidence permitted. The truth, they told. The specific German military's honest professional judgment about the United States Marine Corps was one of the most complete external analytical portraits of the Corps ever produced. By the time the documents were declassified and studied by military historians in the late 1970s, the Marine Corps had fought 3 more wars since Guadalcanal: Korea, Vietnam, and the Cold War operations that had not yet ended. The institutional qualities that the German analysts had identified in their 1942 assessments, the marksmanship, the physical conditioning, the Kursgeist, had not diminished in the intervening decades. They had been maintained, deliberately and explicitly, by an institution that understood from its own history that those qualities were not accidents of recruitment or products of individual excellence, but the outputs of a specific training and selection system that had to be sustained through constant effort against the institutional entropy that every large organization experiences. The German intelligence reports, when they finally became available to historians, were not primarily valued for what they revealed about German intelligence methodology or about the specific tactical capabilities the German analysts had identified. They were valued for something more fundamental. They were the honest external assessment of an institution by professional observers who had no institutional reason to be generous and who were, in fact, trying to find vulnerabilities to exploit, and who had concluded that there were very few, and that the ones that existed were the same ones that any military force possesses when it is operating at the extreme limit of its supply, its manpower, and its human endurance. The Marine Corps was not invincible. The German analysts said so clearly. What it was, and what the German analysts described with a precision that the American classification authorities of 1942 found worth protecting, was the closest thing to a purpose-built fighting institution that the modern military had produced. The documents that captured that assessment spent 30 years in a vault because the men who put them there understood that some truths about the nature of a fighting force are worth more as strategic secrets than as public records. They were right, and the force those documents described has spent the 80 years since Guadalcanal doing what it was trained and built and institutionally designed to do, proving those documents correct.